The reason I titled this as Musings is because these are not thoughts that are very well formulated yet, but I think that's all they are. They're just sort of reflections and musings on I think where we find ourselves right now, and it's very much about our sort of local context here. And I want to start by saying that I think there are something that I've noticed over the last sort of 5 or 6 years that's been emerging is that I feel that there are two, in the world that I live in and operate in, two quite prominent narratives that have emerged. One, within the society more generally, there's a sense of people who feel left behind, marginalized, ignored. There are all sorts of different labels we apply to that. I mean, some of them can be quite crude, like white working class and so on. Whatever the right labels are, just for brevity, let's go with some of these more simplistic labels for now. But there is a view that funnels into the instinct for Brexit, into a wider set of grievances and narratives that we see operating in our nation. And at the same time, and obviously all of us we live in this country and we have a foot in that world. And at the same time, those of us who work within Muslim communities or work with Muslim communities can't have, avoided noticing the sort of, almost like a mirror of that, emerging and developing within Muslim communities. And essentially what I want to try and say is that these two narratives that are developing are so different and so separate, and yet share so much. There are so many parallels there in terms of the discourse and the vocabulary that's used, and some of the sentiments that are used within both of those narratives. They almost work opposite to each other in the public domain, because one feeds off the other often, and yet they have so much in common that they don't recognize, I think, when they look at each other. And so when I think of this, this sort of almost like a competitive victimhood that's emerging and has been developing between these two cohorts, between these two groups. I mean, I look at where Muslim debates are at right now, and I think that we have, at least I would like to propose, and I may be wrong, but I'd like to propose that there are 3 or 4 ideas that I think have come to dominate our public narrative. There's something about colonialism and the history and legacy of colonialism. There's something about securitization of Muslims and the way people have been engaged with as a counter-terror and a counter-extremism threat. And there's something about socioeconomic disenfranchisement. I know that's not going to be the case in the US, but here in most parts of Europe, that's still a very prominent narrative amongst Muslim communities. Not to say that either of those 3 are untrue. I think they're all very true, and they all have, and it's no accident that those things reverberate in Muslim experience and in Muslim discourses. They are clearly an important part of the life that Muslims have come to lead. But somehow these 3 things feed into a sense of prejudice and anti-Muslim sentiment and a framing of whatever whether you call it Islamophobia or anti-Muslim prejudice or whatever. We have these debates about how to define these terms right now, and that for me has come to define a very politicized identity for Muslims. All of these three factors that I mentioned that funnel into a sense of prejudice. And again, I'm not saying that the prejudice is somehow imagined just because I'm trying to frame this in the narrative of a victimhood. I'm not saying it's to be ignored or imagined or somehow deflected away from. These are very deep and real sentiments and experiences of people. But at the same time, they are not the sum total of the lives of British Muslims. Our lives are far more than that. And it's almost as though we've given up any sense of agency to be able to craft our own lives, tell our own stories, and we keep defaulting to a narrative that, to me, sounds lazy. For us to snap back to that narrative sounds like a lazy way of constructing an identity. I don't know about you, but I don't feel, and I would imagine some of you feel far more empowered than I do. I don't feel so disempowered that I have to have a narrative foisted on me. I'm confident enough, and I feel energized enough, and I have enough agency to be able to craft my own narrative. And so my question and my appeal to Muslims is, if you want to tell your story, I give you a microphone for 10 minutes or 20 minutes. What's the story you want to tell? What is the tale you want to tell to this wonderful nation that we live in? Because we all have that agency. I don't think anybody has taken that agency away from us. We only give that agency away ourselves by continuously following a narrative that we, at the same time, complain is being foisted on us, and then argue and then perpetuate by continuing to talk about it and talk through the lens of it. So part of my urgency and priority of the last few years has been to say, how can I almost sidestep that framing and that narrative, and what narratives can we construct for ourselves? What stories can we tell of our own making, of our own imagination, of our own will? And I don't think any of us lack the agency or the will or the courage or the means to tell those stories. If I go to the core of Islam and interrogate and ask myself, what is it that Islam is actually about? What is it a force for? Not against, but for. And I need to go to those sorts of values that we all think of as those, core cardinal values of Islam, such as compassion and rahmah and love and mercy and justice and equity and so on and so forth. All Muslims, or everybody who's not even a Muslim, will recognize those values. They're human values, they're Christian values, they're Jewish values, they're the values of any sensible person, of any sensible human being. But we also would say they are very Muslim values. They deeply permeate the religious texts of Islam. Muslims say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim when they're encouraged to say that when they begin anything. We're encouraged to live an intentional life. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said every action is by its intentions. And on the one hand, you could say this is about dedicating everything you do to God and remembering God in everything that you do. But I would also say there's another meaning to that, and that is that we are supposed to live intentionally and not just passively, as though something is just being done to us. It's again is a reminder that we have agency in our hands. So when we do something, we do it consciously. We do it with an intention, with a volition, with a sense of purpose. Not that we feel that we are some sort of passive recipients of history and people are colonizing us and people are victimizing us and people are foisting this on top of us and so on. I believe that these are all very small, low-level, subconscious things that are tools that allow us to actually escape from the captivity of that type of history and to be able to give us an agency to propel ourselves. And I would add to that list of values that I was mentioning earlier, we know of concepts such as justice and adl, balance, but also reciprocity. Reciprocity is something that is there at the core of all religions. When we talk about the golden thread of religion, of religious teachings, the golden rule, whatever you call it, basically treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. None of you truly believes until you love for your brother what you love for yourself. And so on, those sorts of teachings, they lie at the core of any religious set of advices, set of morals, set of guidances, principles. And Islam is no different. And so from there, I think we can look outwards and say, well, what does a community that represents less than 5% of a population say to the 95% of the people that are around it? Because I think for us to start from a position of saying we have a grievance against you is really a non-starter. I mean, if that's the framing of our conversation, there's no there's no accident that we're going to have a very difficult time ahead. And I think if we go to the roots of the religion and we go to the stories that the Quran is trying to tell us again and again in its history, again and again in its narratives of different prophets, of different people, and prophets coming to their people, and yes, by definition of a fact of a prophet in the Quranic narratives, a prophet coming to his people, they're coming to critique something, they're coming to correct something, but they're calling out to the people saying, "Oh my people, ya qawmi." And in the language of Arabic, this comes across as something that is actually beautiful and warm and embracing, not condemning and separating. And adopting that psychology, adopting that approach is something I think we have failed to do so far in terms of the way that this 5% relates to the 95%. We behave as though we are the 95%. And for us to ignore that sheer differential of numerics is suicidal and stupid. I'm not saying that we give up our principles. This is not an appeal to washing down Islam or just merely compromising and so on. It's an appeal to going to the roots of our faith and asserting it confidently, but in the spirit with which the faith itself speaks and with which it talks. And so what we've allowed to happen, I think, by not being attentive to those sorts of ideas, is we've allowed the fringes to dominate the debate. We've allowed the fringes to frame the debate and to dominate, and in a more unkind way, you could say it's the lunatics have taken over the asylum. The debate isn't being run by the majority of people. Everybody is complaining, whether it's in the nation, whether it's within Muslim communities. Everybody's complaining about the way in which the debate is being crafted. And while I think in the nation we have mechanisms for trying to redress that, they may be effective or not effective to varying degrees, but within the Muslim community it almost feels as though we don't have a mechanism to win back the debate, to take back the microphone from those who have seized it. Because where do you go? Is it an organization? Is it the MCB? Is it this group? Is it that group? Who is the sane voice of Muslim communities? And I don't think we will have, and these are big structural problems and issues, I don't think we'll have answers to that. I think I'm not asking for a Muslim archbishop or a Muslim chief rabbi or a Muslim federation or council or something like that. That's not what I'm asking for. But I think in the absence of those sorts of mechanisms and means, we're going to have to create a lot of these sorts of spaces where people can be self-critical, where people can talk with each other, be able to disagree with each other and be respected for their disagreements and the challenges that they bring to each other. Because these are the sorts of things, in the absence of greater structural solutions, it's not that we can only do nothing. Our options aren't nothing or big structures. So I think the onus is on us, people like us, people who, and I'm not saying we all agree, far from it. There are many, many divergent views here in a room like this. But it's for people like us to come together and to be able to find those mechanisms. Critically, and I want to suggest 3 things to finish. In terms of having that conversation, I think critically, we need to resist the populism that is out there. And we think of, you mention a word like populism and we think of Donald Trump. We might think of Boris Johnson. But we often don't think of the Muslim leaders that are peddling populism. Because that is also another form of populism. And I'm not trying to detract from those other 2 labels. I think they're very rightly deserved. But just in the same vein, and in a way of more concern to me, because it's closer to me, and it's something that I have more power over, agency over, is the Muslim leaders I see who pander to populistic views, who will very happily stand and talk about an issue, whether it's against the Ahmadiyya or against gay people or against the increasing emancipation of women and the slow progress we're making in terms of leadership of women in our community. They'll talk about those issues in very black and white terms, in very categorical terms, knowing that they're pandering to a base, knowing that they're empowering that base, and knowing that will get them more support from that base. What is that but the definition of populism? And so we're used to using that word outside of the Muslim community, but we don't recognize that when it's within our own. For so long, preachers have come to this country or have spoken in forums and platforms in this country where they demonize one group, stigmatize one group, and they get, as they say in Urdu, talia, lots and lots of applause, lots and lots of laudits. because of what they're saying. And that feeds their ego even further, and they become bigger stars, they become social media demagogues, and they're able to sway their audiences and pull them in all sorts of directions. So we need to resist that. And it really is people like us, I think, who can, rise above this impasse, resist these things. And the three things I want to suggest then in terms of the way in which we can frame this sort of conversation, and I'll leave it there. One, we speak about this all the time, our theology really needs to reverberate with the context. It needs to grow out of the context. It needs to live and breathe in the context that we find ourselves. If it doesn't, it's meaningless. If it doesn't, it's irrelevant to us. If it doesn't, Ibrahim Musa talked about this. Many of the other speakers may have touched on this throughout these 2 days. But if our theology is something, the challenge for any religion is this, isn't it? That you have a text, or you have a body of teachings, or you have a living tradition that emerged some 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, using vocabulary, using idioms, metaphor that to us now are long lost. How do we make sense of them? How do we use them and go back to them and refer to them in a way as though they were being revealed to us today? We can't at one level because their words are there, their teachings are there, and most Muslims would say that the words of the Quran are there. It's dried, the ink has dried, and yet we have to live with those words. And unless we have an ongoing revelatory understanding of the Quran, not that the revelation itself is continuing, but unless we allow the revelation to keep speaking to us, we freeze those words in their time. We don't allow those words to have meaning and ongoing relevance in our everyday life. And so we are not conscious of the fact that even as I go to the text, or you go to the text, or a scholar goes to the text and interprets from the text, that they are taking the context to the text and interacting with it. We're unconscious of that process, and so we try to then pull out an opinion from a book from 400 years ago, or 600 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, where the issues that we were debating that we are debating now are far removed from their lives. So a theology of the context, and that conversation needs to be rooted in the context. And the context must inform the scholarship and the theology must inform, likewise, the context. And secondly, one was that we need these spaces, and thirdly, that this, critically for us, this space has to be a collaborative space. This space is no longer a space for Muslims. It's no longer a Muslim conversation. Even the detailed conversation of Muslim theology, even the detailed debates about what Islam means, is not a Muslim-only conversation. We have to open it up. We have to allow and encourage, not just open it and allow others, but to encourage others, invite others who are not of the Muslim faith, invite others who believe in no religion at all, to come and give reflections and thoughts and insights and really develop a partnership in order to move us forward. Because why would we not? Why would we not do that if we feel that there are talented people out there who have something to say? I remind people that the first person who interpreted the Quran in Islam, this is called tafsir. It's a flippant example, but it's also meaningful. The first person who interpreted the Quran for the Prophet was a Christian called Waraqah ibn Nawfal. When the Prophet received, according to the Muslim narrative, the verses of Iqra come to the Prophet ﷺ, and he's dazed. He's in this sort of, I don't know what's going on. And he goes to his wife, and his wife also doesn't know what's going on, Khadija. She says, come, I'll take you to Waraqah. He's, her cousin. He's a Christian guy who's steeped in this sort of stuff. He knows about religion. And they go to him, and he gives them his take on what these verses might mean. So if it happened at the time of the Prophet, and when we look at the seerah, our current reading of the seerah is one of the life of the Prophet, is one in which the role of people who are not Muslims have almost been whitewashed out. The people who protected him, the people who helped him, supported him, allied with him, stood with him at very delicate moments when the Prophet is leaving Mecca out of fear of his life, and there are only 2 or 3 other people who know of his plans, the guide who is taking him is not Muslim. If the Prophet's idea of religion was so close as it is today that we can only trust this group of people, he wouldn't have done that. He would have found a Muslim guide who could take him. The person who protected him throughout his early life, his uncle, wasn't Muslim. The person who protected him after his uncle died wasn't Muslim. If you take away the people who are not Muslims from the life of the Prophet, you take away Islam. It doesn't even begin. It doesn't even start. It's stillbirth if you remove all of those influences. So if it worked then, why can't it work now? Why have we created an identity that is so rigid, that is so based around patrolling boundaries, when I would argue that Islam was always about breaking down boundaries. It was about opening up the house so that anybody could come in, whether it was for a fleeting moment, whether it was as a wayfarer, whether it was just to say, well, yeah, you're here, you're a neighbor, you're in the vicinity. So those are the 3 things I wanted to say. I'm going to leave it there, and we have time for conversation. Open it up to you guys. Thank you very much indeed.